didn't mean to find it, and if I had known that opening that small compartment beneath the dashboard would divide my life into before and after, I would have closed the car door and walked back inside pretending I forgot why I came out in the first place. But life doesn't give warnings like that. It hides the detonator inside ordinary afternoons. Daniel had called from work asking me to grab his laptop from the back seat because he forgot it again, and I remember teasing him about how he'd forget his own head one day, and he laughed and said that's why he had me, and I smiled because that was our rhythm, comfortable, practiced, safe. The driveway was quiet, the air still, nothing dramatic about the moment, and when I opened the passenger door, I noticed the car looked strangely neat, not just tidy but intentionally wiped down like someone preparing it for inspection. I leaned forward to reach for the laptop, and that's when I saw the phone tucked into the compartment beneath the dashboard. A black case, no cracks, no identifying marks, just sitting there like it didn't belong to anyone. My first reaction wasn't betrayal, it was confusion, because Daniel wasn't secretive. He left his regular phone around the house all the time, showered with the bathroom door open, handed me his device to reply to texts while he drove. I picked up the second phone expecting it to be locked, but the screen lit immediately, and my stomach tightened, because unlocked things are either forgotten or deliberately safe. There were only 3 apps visible: messages, photos, notes, and something about that minimalism felt calculated. I told myself I was overthinking and opened messages just to confirm it was harmless, and saw there was only one conversation thread. And when I read the name Claire, I actually exhaled in relief, because Claire was my sister. And for a fragile second, I convinced myself this was a surprise they were planning together. Maybe for my birthday, maybe something thoughtful, and I almost smiled at how dramatic my imagination had been. Then I opened the thread, and the first message at the bottom of the screen said, "When are you telling her about the baby?" And my body reacted before my mind did, because I felt the blood drain from my face and the world narrow into a tunnel. I read it again slowly as if packing would change meaning, but the words remained steady and unambiguous. The baby, not a baby, the baby. I scrolled up with shaking fingers, and each message felt like descending stairs into a basement I didn't know existed. I miss you already. Last night was worth the risk. I hate acting normal in front of her. I wish we didn't have to hide forever. And my chest felt like it was tightening around something sharp. Then I saw an ultrasound image embedded in the thread, and Daniel had replied, "That's our little peanut," and that word shattered whatever denial I was still holding, because it meant inclusion, partnership, something built deliberately behind my back. I stood there in the driveway holding proof that my husband and my sister were expecting a child together, and the strangest part was how quiet everything felt. No dramatic music, no thunder, just the faint sound of a neighbor's sprinkler turning on. My mind replayed every family dinner over the past year, every holiday photo, every time Claire lingered in the kitchen with him while I set the table, every subtle glance I had dismissed because I trusted them both completely. Claire was my little sister, the one I helped with homework growing up, the one I defended when our parents criticized her impulsive decisions, the one who cried to me after her last breakup saying she wished she could find someone stable and kind like Daniel. I remember telling her she would one day and meaning it. I don't remember walking back into the house, but suddenly I was in the kitchen staring at the counter as if it might explain how this happened. I sat down and scrolled further, their messages stretching back nearly a year, starting cautiously, innocent check-ins about how I was stressed from work, Daniel venting about feeling disconnected, Claire responding with empathy that slowly blurred into intimacy. I saw the progression like watching rot spread under paint, subtle at first, then undeniable. There were moments where Claire hesitated in the texts, saying this feels wrong, we can't keep doing this, and Daniel reassuring her that he and I were already distant, that I wouldn't understand him the way she did, and reading that felt like discovering a narrative about my own marriage that I had never been invited into. By the time Daniel's car pulled into the driveway an hour later, I wasn't crying. I wasn't screaming. I was sitting at the table with the phone placed in front of me like evidence in a trial. When he walked in, he smiled automatically and asked if I found the laptop, and I held up the phone instead and watched the shift in his face, the flicker of calculation before the color drained. He didn't deny it, which somehow hurt more than excuses would have, because it meant the truth was too solid to argue. I asked him calmly when he was planning to tell me about the baby, and the way his shoulders dropped told me he had rehearsed this scenario in his mind before. He sat down slowly and said it wasn't supposed to happen like this, and I remember thinking betrayal never arrives the way it's supposed to. I asked how long, and he said almost a year, and that number echoed because a year meant shared holidays, anniversaries, lazy Sundays on the couch, all layered with deception so seamless I never noticed the seams. I asked if he loved her, and he hesitated, which felt worse than a yes because it meant he didn't even know what he was destroying our marriage for. When I asked if the baby was his, he said yes without drama, and that finality made something inside me harden. I didn't scream, not at first. I just asked him to explain, and he told me it started when I was overwhelmed with work last winter, and he felt invisible, and Claire listened, and one night it crossed a line, and after that it felt easier to keep crossing. He said he never meant to hurt me, which felt absurd because harm had been repeated for months. I asked him if they had talked about leaving me, and he said they didn't know what they were doing, and that uncertainty felt like another form of cruelty, because it meant my life was collateral damage in their confusion. When he reached for my hand, I pulled away because physical touch felt dishonest now, and I told him to leave. He packed a bag quietly as if noise might make it worse, and when the door closed behind him, the house felt larger and emptier at the same time. Claire called the next morning, and I let it ring until the silence felt heavier than the sound, and when I finally answered, she was already crying and saying she never planned for this, and that she didn't expect to fall in love, and I stopped her at that word because hearing love attached to something that required so much lying felt grotesque. She said she found out she was pregnant 3 months ago, and they'd been trying to figure out how to tell me, and I asked her if she ever looked at me across the dinner table and felt even a moment of guilt, and she went quiet long enough for the answer to settle. I hung up before she could justify it further because explanations felt like salt. Over the next week, the shock turned into something colder and more focused, and I filed for divorce not in a fit of rage, but with deliberate clarity because I realized I could survive pain, but I couldn't survive living in a house where trust had evaporated. Daniel didn't contest it, and that lack of fight unsettled me because it meant he had already stepped partially into another life. My parents were devastated when they found out, and my mother kept asking how this could happen under her roof during family gatherings, and my father avoided eye contact with everyone as if shame were contagious. Claire moved in with Daniel within a month, and I tried not to picture it, but my mind supplied images anyway. Her toothbrush in my old bathroom, her shoes by the door where mine used to sit. Weeks passed, and the anger began to shift into something more complex, grief not just for the marriage, but for the sister I thought I had. Then one evening, my mother came to see me, and she looked exhausted in a way that made her seem smaller, and she told me something I didn't expect. She said Claire had always felt second to me growing up, that she compared herself constantly, that when Daniel confided in her about feeling overlooked, she felt chosen in a way she never had before, and hearing that didn't excuse anything, but it revealed that this betrayal wasn't born overnight. It was fertilized by years of insecurity I never saw. I lay awake that night realizing how fragile perception is, how two people can live in the same family and carry entirely different narratives. Months later, Daniel asked to meet to discuss final paperwork, and I agreed because avoidance no longer protected me. He looked thinner, more tired, and he admitted something that shifted the ground again. He said Claire had been seeing someone briefly before him, and there was a small uncertainty about timing, and he wasn't completely sure the baby was his, but she was convinced, and he had chosen to believe it because it simplified the chaos, and I stared at him wondering how something already so destructive could still be unstable underneath. I asked if he told her about his doubts, and he said no because he didn't want to stress her during pregnancy, and that omission felt like yet another layer of dishonesty, woven into something already broken. As the due date approached, I tried to detach, but detachment is not a switch you flip. It's a muscle you build slowly and painfully. And when I heard the baby had been born, I felt an ache I couldn't categorize. Not jealousy, not longing, just the weight of finality. Weeks later, Claire called me again, and her voice sounded different, strained and brittle. And she told me Daniel had quietly requested a paternity test, and the results had come back negative, and I felt the air shift around me because suddenly the foundation of their new life had cracked. She said he left 2 days after the results and told her he needed space to figure out who he was. And as she cried, I heard an echo of my own earlier devastation and realized betrayal often circles back in unexpected ways. She asked me if I felt satisfied, and I told her the truth, which was no, because nothing about this felt like justice. It felt like damage multiplying. In the silence that followed, I understood that the story wasn't about revenge or karma, but about choices and consequences, and the way people reach for escape without calculating the cost. Months later, Daniel showed up at my door unexpectedly, and for a split second I saw the man I married instead of the man who shattered our life. And he said he had been in therapy, and that he understood now that what he felt with Claire wasn't love but validation, and that he had confused attention with connection. And he said he wanted to try again if there was any possibility left, and I listened without interrupting, because I needed to hear the full arc of his reasoning before deciding anything, and when. He finished, I asked him one question that had been sitting quietly in my mind. I asked if the baby had been his, would he still be standing here? And he hesitated just long enough to confirm what I already knew, and in that pause, I found my answer. I told him I hoped he continued therapy, and that I genuinely wanted him to become someone better, but not for me. And when I closed the door, I felt something settle inside my chest. Not triumph, not even relief, but steadiness. The kind that comes from choosing yourself after being treated as optional. Over time, I rebuilt routines, friendships, parts of myself that had shrunk quietly during the marriage. And sometimes people ask if I regret opening that car compartment, and I tell them I regret the pain, but not the truth, because living inside a comfortable lie would have been a slower kind of destruction. And the day I found that message from my sister wasn't the day my life ended. It was the day it stopped being built on someone else's secrecy and started being built on my own clarity. Over time, I rebuilt routines, friendships, parts of myself that had shrunk quietly during the marriage. And sometimes people ask if I regret opening that car compartment, and I tell them I regret the pain, but not the truth, because living inside a comfortable lie would have been a slower kind of destruction. And the day I found that message from my sister wasn't the day my life ended. It was the day it stopped being built on someone else's secrecy and started being built on my own clarity. What I didn't expect was that clarity doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in waves, and some of those waves drag things back to shore that you thought had already drowned. In the months after Daniel showed up at my door asking for another chance, I started noticing how often I replayed our entire marriage, not just the affair, but the years before it, searching for hairline fractures I had ignored. There were moments I had dismissed as normal stress, evenings when he seemed distant, and I told myself it was work, conversations where he complained about feeling unappreciated, and I reassured him without realizing he wasn't asking for reassurance, but for reinforcement. I began to see how subtle dissatisfaction can fester when neither person names it directly, and how silence can create space for someone else to step in and fill it. That realization didn't excuse what he did, but it forced me to confront something uncomfortable, that marriages rarely collapse from a single explosion. They erode slowly before they finally crack. Around that time, Claire reached out again, not to cry this time, but to talk, and I almost didn't answer because reopening wounds felt dangerous. But curiosity won over resentment. She sounded tired in a way that felt deeper than exhaustion. She said Daniel had changed after the paternity results came back, that he became withdrawn and defensive, that he blamed her for not being honest about the timing, even though he had never asked for honesty in the first place. She admitted something then that I hadn't expected. She said in the beginning Daniel was the one who pushed harder, that when she hesitated, he reassured her that our marriage had already been emotionally over, that he made her feel like she was saving him from loneliness rather than stealing something from me. Hearing that didn't shock me as much as it should have, because I had started piecing together a version of him I hadn't wanted to see, a man who preferred validation over accountability. Claire said she had believed him when he told her I didn't really understand him anymore and that he felt invisible at home. And for a moment, I felt a flicker of anger, not at her, but at the narrative he had crafted, because invisibility is a powerful word, and if someone repeats it long enough, it becomes justification. I asked her if she ever once confronted him about telling me the truth, and she said she did early on, but he always had a reason to delay, always said the timing wasn't right, that he didn't want to hurt me until he knew what he truly wanted. That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended because it reframed the affair not as mutual recklessness, but as controlled postponement. I began to wonder how much of what happened was emotional confusion and how much was deliberate compartmentalization. Weeks later, I ran into Daniel unexpectedly at a mutual friend's gathering, and he looked startled to see me, almost guilty in a way that seemed disproportionate for someone who had already confessed everything. We exchanged polite words, but as the evening went on, I noticed how carefully he curated his image, how he spoke about therapy and growth and mistakes in a way that sounded rehearsed, like he had practiced accountability enough to sound convincing. At one point, he said something that lingered in my mind. He said sometimes you don't realize how much you're drowning until someone throws you a rope, and I realized he was still framing Claire as rescue rather than rupture. That was the moment I understood the final piece of it, that Daniel's greatest flaw wasn't betrayal itself but narrative control. He shaped every version of events in a way that preserved his self-image, first as neglected husband, then as confused lover, then as wounded almost father, and finally as redeemed man seeking forgiveness. In every version, he was reacting, never initiating. That realization didn't ignite rage. It sparked clarity because I finally saw how easy it had been for him to drift between roles while the consequences remained attached to everyone else. Claire had lost her relationship with me and the stability she thought she was building. I had lost a marriage and a sister, and he had lost comfort but gained a storyline about growth. The more distance I put between myself and that pattern, the more I noticed how often I had minimized my own needs during our marriage, how often I smoothed over tension to keep peace, how often I accepted partial effort because it was easier than confrontation. The final twist wasn't explosive. It didn't arrive in the form of another secret phone or hidden pregnancy. It arrived quietly when I realized I had been participating in a dynamic where my stability allowed him to feel secure enough to seek excitement elsewhere. That realization wasn't self-blame. It was self-awareness, because understanding your part in a system doesn't mean you caused its collapse, but it does mean you can avoid rebuilding the same structure again. Months later, Daniel sent one last message saying he respected my decision and hoped I found happiness, and I read it without emotion because I no longer needed closure from him. I had already taken it. Claire eventually moved to another city with the baby, and our contact faded into occasional updates through our parents. And while the pain of what happened never disappeared completely, it stopped dominating my thoughts. I began dating cautiously, not because I distrusted everyone, but because I trusted myself enough to notice red flags early. The irony of everything is that the most devastating discovery of my life forced me to develop instincts I had ignored for years. Sometimes I drive past the old house, and I don't feel heartbreak anymore. I feel gratitude that the truth surfaced before decades passed, that the fracture revealed itself before children and mortgages made departure more complicated. The day I found that phone, I thought my world was ending, but now I see it was exposing, stripping away illusions I didn't know I was clinging to. Betrayal is loud at first, but its lessons are quiet, and the quiet is what stays with you. I don't speak to Daniel, and I don't speak to Claire, and maybe one day forgiveness will look like something softer than distance, but for now distance is peace. When I think back to that ordinary Tuesday afternoon, I don't see it as the moment everything fell apart. I see it as the moment I stopped being the last person to know the truth about my own life. And that shift, painful as it was, became the foundation for everything that followed.